In the autumn of 1992, the air in Cody, Wyoming, carried the sharp, clean promise of winter. The aspen trees that lined the Shoshone River had turned a brilliant, fiery gold, and the days grew shorter, crisper. For the people who called this rugged corner of the world home, it was a season of preparation, a final breath of warmth before the snows came to blanket the mountains. For the Peterson family, it was a time of familiar ritual. Danny Peterson was a man carved from the Wyoming landscape itself. At 42, he was a carpenter by trade, his hands calloused and strong from shaping wood, but his spirit belonged to the wild places. He wasn't a thrill-seeker. He was a student of the wilderness, a quiet observer who moved through the forest with a reverence that other hunters often mistook for simple caution. He understood its rhythms, its dangers, and its unwritten laws. His sanctuary was a small workshop behind his modest house, a place that smelled perpetually of sawdust and gun oil. It was there, just days before he was scheduled to leave for his annual solo hunting trip, that he passed on his knowledge to his son. Leo, at 14, was a lanky teenager, all sharp angles and quiet intensity. He watched his father's every move, absorbing the lessons that couldn't be taught in a classroom. Danny held up a brass compass, its face worn smooth from years of use. It felt heavy and important in Leo's hand. "Everything out there has a language," Danny said, his voice low and steady. "The wind in the pines, the tracks in the mud, the stars at night. This is the grammar. It'll never lie to you, but you have to listen. The forest always tells a story, Leo. You just have to learn its language." For Leo, this wasn't just a lesson in navigation. It was a sacred rite, a father entrusting his son with the code to his own world. He didn't know then that this memory would become the cornerstone of a 30-year obsession. The morning he left was an ordinary Tuesday. The air was cold and the sky was a vast clear blue. Danny's old Ford truck was already packed, his rifle secured in its case, his gear organized with the meticulous care of a man who leaves nothing to chance. His wife, Sarah, stood on the porch handing him a thermos of coffee. There were no tears, no dramatic farewells. This was a yearly tradition, a part of the man she loved. She trusted him, and she trusted the wilderness he knew so well. Danny knelt down to look his son in the eye. "Be good for your mom, Leo," he said, his hand resting for a moment on the back of Leo's neck, a simple gesture of love and confidence. Leo just nodded, watching as his father climbed into the truck, turned the key, and drove down the gravel road, a plume of dust rising behind him. He watched until the truck was just a speck, swallowed by the immense landscape. It was the last time he would ever see him. The first few days passed with an easy silence. The house was quieter without Danny's steady presence, but it was a familiar quiet. Sarah went about her routine, and Leo went to school. They expected him back on Sunday. When Sunday came and went, there was no immediate panic. The weather could turn, a trail could be blocked. Danny was resourceful. He would know how to wait it out. But then Monday passed, and Tuesday. An unspoken tension began to coil in the air of the small house. Sarah's hands would still when she was washing dishes, her gaze lost somewhere out the kitchen window. Leo found himself watching the road, the sound of every passing truck, a false alarm that sent a jolt through his chest. They spoke little of it, as if giving voice to the fear would make it real. By Wednesday, the silence in the house had become heavy, suffocating. The story the forest was telling had turned into one they couldn't understand. The dread arrived in physical form late that afternoon. It wasn't a phone call. It was the slow crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, a sound that was deep and official. Leo looked out the window and saw it. A dark green Park Service vehicle. 2 men in uniform stepped out. They moved with a slow, deliberate gravity, removing their wide-brimmed hats as they approached the front porch. The world seemed to slow down. The light of the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the lawn. Leo could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow, counting down the final seconds of his childhood. Saw his mother open the door, her face a pale mask of questioning hope. He didn't need to hear the words. He saw it in the way the rangers couldn't meet his mother's eyes. He saw it in the gentle, sorrowful shake of the lead ranger's head. He saw his mother's hands fly to her mouth, and he heard a sound escape her that wasn't a word or a scream, but the sound of a life shattering into a million pieces. In that moment, the familiar world of maps, compasses, and loving fathers vanished forever, replaced by a terrible, silent, and gaping void. The man who knew the language of the forest had disappeared, and his story had abruptly, inexplicably ended. The days that followed were a blur of organized chaos. The disappearance of a man like Danny Peterson was an affront to the natural order of things in Park County, and the community responded in force. Search and rescue teams swarmed the trailhead where his truck had been found. Helicopters sliced through the cold mountain air, their rotor wash whipping the tops of the pines. Volunteers on foot and on horseback fanned out in grid patterns, their bright orange vests stark against the gray rock and deep green of the forest. From the window of his home, Leo watched it all unfold with a sense of profound detachment. He felt like a spectator to his own life's collapse. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered hushed, hollow condolences. Friends of his father, men with weathered faces and grim expressions, would stop by to update. Sarah, speaking in low tones about search sectors and weather fronts, they spoke of Danny in the past tense, a subtle shift in language that felt like a betrayal. Leo wanted to scream that they were looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for a man who was lost. His father was not lost. He knew this wilderness better than he knew the streets of his own town. But when he tried to voice this to one of the lead investigators, a man with tired eyes and a weary patience, he was met with a gentle, dismissive pat on the shoulder. "Your dad was a great outdoorsman, son, but this land, it doesn't care how great you are." They saw a grieving boy, not a key witness to his own father's character. The discovery of the truck was the only solid piece of evidence they had. It was parked cleanly at the trailhead, locked, with no signs of a struggle. To the investigators, this was the beginning and end of the story. He parked his truck, walked into the woods, and never walked out. The official theory quickly solidified. Danny had gotten disoriented, perhaps injured in a fall, and succumbed to the elements. Or, the more sensational and popular theory, he had a fatal encounter with a grizzly bear. It was a clean, tragic, and, for the authorities, a closed narrative. For Leo, it was a narrative full of holes. His father's primary pack, the one with his tent and most of his supplies, was gone, which fit the theory. But his emergency kit, a small, meticulously packed bag he always kept under the driver's seat, was still there. Danny had a rule: you never, ever leave your vehicle without your emergency kit. It was a small detail, an inconsistency that nagged at Leo, a loose thread in a story that was otherwise being stitched shut. The search was officially called off after 2 weeks. The first snows of the season had begun to fall, dusting the high peaks in white and making any further efforts impossible. The public was told that everything that could be done had been done. The case would remain open, they said, but it was now a recovery mission, not a rescue. Hope was officially retired. It was during this time of crushing finality that Marcus Finch became a regular presence. Finch was a local legend in his own right, a trapper and hunter whose knowledge of the mountains was rivaled only by Danny's. He was charming, with a confident smile and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the wild. He'd been a vocal part of the search, and he would often stop by the Peterson house to sit with Sarah. He'd tell stories of his own close calls in the wilderness, framing Danny's disappearance as a tragic but honorable fate for a true mountain man. Leo remembered him clearly sitting in his father's armchair drinking a cup of coffee. He even put a hand on Leo's shoulder once and said, "Your father was the best. If this could happen to him, it could happen to any of us." At the time, the gesture felt like a form of solidarity, but a deeper, colder memory fought for space in Leo's mind. He remembered a few weeks before the trip, his father coming home late, his face tight with anger. He'd been arguing with Finch over a territory dispute, something about illegal traps Finch was rumored to be setting. "That man has no respect," Danny had muttered. A fleeting moment of discord, now a sinister echo in a house filled with false sympathy. Years bled into one another, each one burying the mystery under a fresh layer of time. The case files were boxed up and sent to an archive. The news crews moved on. The world forgot. But Leo could not. He finished high school, his grades slipping as his focus remained fixed on the maps and notes that now papered the walls of his bedroom. He didn't leave for college. He couldn't. Leaving felt like abandoning his post. Sarah's health began to fail. The official cause was a weak heart, but Leo knew she was dying of a broken one. She died in the spring of 2005, her son holding her hand. Her last whispered words were not of comfort or peace, but a single haunting question. "Where is he, Leo?" The weight of that question, the burden of that vigil, now fell to him alone. He stayed in the house, a ghost in his own family home. He took a quiet job at the local library, a position that allowed him the solitude and resources to continue his silent investigation. He filed information requests, slowly accumulating copies of every document related to his father's case. The police reports, the witness statements, the topographical maps of the search grids. He learned the language of the investigation, the cold, bureaucratic terms for his family's enduring agony. To the outside world, Leo Peterson was a quiet, slightly eccentric man, a bachelor who kept to himself. But within the walls of his house, he was the sole detective on a 30-year-old cold case. He spent his nights under the glow of a single lamp, tracing routes on maps with a red pen, cross-referencing names and timelines, searching for the one detail the professionals had missed. He was no longer a grieving son. He had become an archivist of loss, his life an endless epilogue to a story that had no ending. He'd often returned to the memory of Marcus Finch. The memory had soured over time, the comforting gesture transforming into something grotesque. He'd learned that Finch had grown wealthy over the years, his trapping business expanding significantly. He was a pillar of the community, a man who donated generously to local charities. But Leo saw the shadow. He saw the easy smile and remembered his father's anger. He saw the public face and wondered what lay beneath it. While the world saw a tragic accident, Leo Peterson, alone in his house filled with ghosts, saw the face of a man who had gotten away with murder. The question was no longer just where his father was, but how and why. For 3 decades, the story of Danny Peterson remained frozen in time, an artifact of local history preserved in yellowing newspaper clippings and the fading memories of a town. The narrative was dormant, sealed shut by the passage of years. The echo that would finally shatter the silence came not from the vast Wyoming wilderness, but from within the climate-controlled stillness of a museum basement nearly 200 miles away. The Wyoming Museum of Natural History in Cheyenne was a repository of the state's long and rugged story. Its public halls displayed dinosaur bones and exhibits on the Oregon Trail, but its heart was in the archives, a labyrinth of steel shelves where priceless objects were stored, cataloged, and preserved. Among them was item number 74B, a magnificent 9-foot grizzly bear, poised in a permanent, silent roar. It had been donated to the museum in the late 1990s from the estate of a wealthy and eccentric private collector. For years, it stood as a testament to the raw power of the American West. In the autumn of 2024, the bear was scheduled for a routine restoration. The task fell to Clara Evans. She was young, but she was one of the best taxidermists the museum had ever employed, possessing a surgeon's steady hand and a historian's reverence for the stories held within the objects she mended. To her, the bear was more than just hide and plaster. It was a time capsule from an era of untamed wilderness. She'd spent 2 days cleaning the fur and repairing a small crack in one of its glass eyes. On the 3rd day, as she was examining the seams, along the animal's flank, her practiced fingers detected an anomaly, Beneath the thick, coarse fur there was a lump. It was hard, rectangular, and felt entirely unnatural. It wasn't a broken piece of the frame, nor was it the random bunching of old wood wool used as filler. It was distinct, foreign. Her curiosity piqued, she called over her supervisor, Dr. Alistair Croft. He was the museum's head curator, a man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and an air of academic authority. He'd seen nearly everything a museum could hold, from fossilized eggs to pioneer diaries. He peered at the spot Clara indicated, his brow furrowed. Probably just a careless repair job from its previous owner, he mused, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. But let's have a look. We can't have our prize grizzly being lumpy. Clara took a scalpel, its sterile blade gleaming under the fluorescent lights. With painstaking care, she began to slice through the thick old stitches of a seam that ran along the bear's side, a seam that looked slightly different from the rest. The hide parted, revealing the dense, dark filling within, and something else, something wrapped in the unmistakable, semi-translucent sheen of old plastic. Dr. Croft leaned in closer, his academic curiosity turning to genuine confusion. Clara reached into the opening with a pair of forceps and gently pulled. The object came free with a soft rustle. It was a Ziploc bag, yellowed with age, and inside it was a man's leather wallet. They stood in stunned silence, the object resting on the clean white surface of a work table. It was an artifact out of time and place, a piece of human life found inside a piece of natural history. It was impossible. A bear is not a treasure chest. The wilderness consumes, it does not preserve and conceal. Dr. Croft, a man who dealt in facts and timelines, was speechless. This discovery didn't fit into any logical framework he knew. After a long moment he cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Clara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "call the police, right now." The news of the discovery traveled through official channels with a quiet urgency. It was a bizarre report, a puzzle with no box, a wallet found inside a museum piece containing the driver's license of a man who had vanished without a trace in 1992. The name on the license was Danny Peterson. The cold case file was pulled from a dusty archive, and a detective was assigned to make the call. In Cody, Leo Peterson was finishing his shift at the library. His life had found a rhythm, a monastic routine of books and silence. He had long ago accepted that his vigil was a solitary one. The world had moved on, and he had remained the quiet keeper of a single cold flame. When his phone rang, he answered with the detached politeness of a librarian, expecting a query about an overdue book. But the voice on the other end was not a patron. It was a woman who introduced herself as Detective Isabella Rossi, with the Laramie County Sheriff's Office. The name of the county meant nothing to him. Then she spoke the words that buckled his knees. "Mr. Peterson, I'm calling about your father, Danny Peterson." Leo had to sit down. The blood rushed to his ears, drowning out the quiet hum of the library. 30 years of silence, and now this. His mind raced. Had they found remains? A piece of old gear? "We've had a strange development," Detective Rossi said, her voice careful, measured. "An object belonging to your father has been recovered." Leo's throat was dry. "What object?" he managed to ask. "His wallet, sir." The word hung in the air. His wallet. A simple, personal item. But it was the detective's next words that fractured Leo's reality for the second time in his life. "Mr. Peterson, the reason I'm calling is because of where it was found. It was found inside a taxidermied bear at the Wyoming Museum of Natural History." Leo said nothing. He couldn't form a thought, let alone a word. A bear. The official story, the narrative that had been the backdrop to his entire adult life, had been a lie. This wasn't a random clue. It was a message, a piece of a twisted, diabolical puzzle left by a ghost. The hope that surged through him was a pure, white-hot agony. It was the return of a feeling he thought had died with his mother, a feeling so powerful it threatened to tear him apart. The long, cold desert of uncertainty he had wandered for 3 decades had just ended. He was now standing at the edge of a whole new wilderness. The 2-hour drive from Cody to Cheyenne felt like a journey to another planet. For 32 years, Leo's world had been contained within the town he grew up in and the vast haunting wilderness that bordered it. Now he was being pulled out of his orbit by a gravitational force he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. It was a treacherous feeling, and he held it at arm's length, protecting himself with a lifetime's worth of practiced cynicism. He expected to be met with the same professional pity he remembered from 1992, to be handled gently and then sent home. He was wrong. Detective Isabella Rossi was nothing like the weary, dismissive investigators from his youth. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She didn't offer platitudes or apologies for his loss. She met him in a sterile, windowless interview room, shook his hand firmly, and got straight to the point. On the table between them were 2 files. One was the original thin file from the Park County Sheriff's Office. The other was a new, expanding file with her name on it. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her tone direct but not unkind, "I've read the official report. All of it. I've also read the coroner's report on the man who donated the bear to the museum, a Mr. Alistair Finch. It appears your father wasn't the only one he shared a history with. Before we go any further, I was told you conducted your own research over the years. I'd like to see it." Leo was taken aback. For the first time in his life, a person in a position of authority was not just acknowledging his obsession, but validating it. He hesitated for a moment, then slid his own worn, bulging accordion file across the table. Rossi opened it. She didn't skim. She read, her eyes tracking across his handwritten notes, his timelines, the newspaper clippings he had laminated to protect them from age. She saw the work of a man who had never given up, and her respect for him was palpable. After 10 minutes of silent reading, she looked up. "You've suspected Marcus Finch from the beginning," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I suspected something wasn't right," Leo corrected, his voice raspy. "Finch was just the part of the story that never fit." Rossi nodded slowly. "Let's see if we can find a better fit." She left the room and returned with a sealed evidence bag. Inside was the wallet. She carefully removed it and placed it on the table. It was water-stained and warped, but it was unmistakably his father's. Leo reached out a trembling hand and touched the worn leather. It was real, a tangible link to a man who had become a ghost. Rossi gave him a moment before she continued, gently sliding the contents, also in evidence bags, onto the table. There was Danny's driver's license, the photo a faded image of a smiling, confident man. There were a few dollars in cash and a creased, well-loved photo of Sarah and a young, gap-toothed Leo. Seeing it felt like a punch to the gut. It was proof that he had been on his father's mind, in his father's pocket, in those final, unknown hours. Then Rossi pushed the last bag forward. It contained a crumpled receipt from a local hardware store. "Forensics went over everything," she explained. "The wallet was sealed in that bag, which is why it was so well preserved. No moisture, no contamination. But the interesting part wasn't the wallet itself. It was this." She showed him a high-resolution photograph on a tablet. It was a scan of the receipt, the original text faded and barely legible. But it was the back of the receipt that held his attention. Under an ultraviolet light, the lab had revealed faint indentations, the ghost of a message written with a ballpoint pen. The lab's software had enhanced the writing, making it clear and undeniable. It was his father's hurried, slightly slanted handwriting. Leo leaned in, his heart pounding. There were 4 short lines. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a Rosetta Stone for 32 years of grief and confusion. Each line was a key unlocking a door that had been sealed shut. Finch, the name of his shadow, the name he had circled 1,000 times on his maps, a license plate, a concrete, verifiable lead, Shadow Creek, a remote, almost inaccessible area in the national forest he knew from his father's maps. And the final line, 2 simple words in his father's language, illegal pelts, provided the one thing he had never had, a motive. It was all there, a final message from the wilderness. His father hadn't been a victim of nature. He had been a witness. He had stumbled upon something criminal, and had been silenced for it. The note was his last, desperate attempt to leave a trail, a story for someone to find. He had entrusted his final words to a receipt, tucked it into his wallet, and in a final act of either desperation or genius, had somehow ensured it ended up inside the very symbol of his own faked demise. A profound, wrenching shift happened inside Leo. The secret, shameful fear he had carried since he was 14, the fear that his father had somehow chosen to leave, that he had failed them, evaporated completely. It was replaced by the clean, cold certainty of murder. His father was not a mystery to be solved, but a man to be avenged. The grief that had defined him for so long was burned away, forged into something harder, sharper. It was a cold, righteous anger. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes meeting Rossi's. She saw the change in him. The haunted, grieving son was gone. In his place was a man with a purpose. "Marcus Finch is still alive," Leo said, his voice steady for the first time. "He lives just outside of town. He thinks he's a local hero." "I know," Rossi replied, her own expression grim. "And Shadow Creek is a 40-minute hike from where your father's truck was found. It was just outside this primary search grid from 1992. The ghost of Danny Peterson had returned. After 32 years of silence, he was finally telling his story. And for the first time, someone was able to understand his language. The hunt had begun. The note was a map, but a map to a ghost. Armed with 32-year-old clues, Detective Rossi began the painstaking work of chasing a shadow. The first lead, the license plate, L. Caesar 22T890, was entered into the system. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed too easy, but the trail vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. A search of the DMV archives revealed the plate belonged to a Ford pickup truck registered to Marcus Finch, but the registration was canceled in 1998. The truck, according to the records, had been sold to a scrapyard in Cheyenne and likely crushed into a featureless block of metal more than 25 years ago. The first door had slammed shut. The next step was more direct. Rossi drove to the sprawling ranch just outside Cody, where Marcus Finch lived. He was 81 years old now, but still tall and imposing, with the same cold, clear eyes Leo remembered from his childhood. He greeted Rossi on his porch with a practiced, neighborly charm, inviting her in for coffee, as if she were a friend, not an officer of the law investigating a potential homicide. He listened to her questions with an air of patient disbelief. When she mentioned the wallet, he shook his head in amazement. "Inside a bear? Well, I'll be. The things you see in a lifetime." He was a masterful performer. When Rossi finally produced the photograph of the note and laid it on the table, Finch stared at it for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle, a sound devoid of humor. "Well, that brings back some memories," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Danny and we were competitors, sure, but we respected each other. We were both fed up with out-of-state poachers hitting our lands. That note," he said, tapping a weathered finger on the image, "was about a plan we had. We were going to track some of these guys ourselves, gather evidence, be heroes." He claimed the license plate was one they'd spotted, and Shadow Creek was their intended meeting point. As for the bear the wallet was found in, he claimed it had been part of a collection his estranged brother Alistair had bought at auction years ago, suggesting the wallet must have been planted there by the very poachers he and Danny were trying to stop. It was a brilliant lie. It was plausible. It recontextualized every piece of evidence, and it painted himself and Danny as partners. He delivered it with the calm conviction of an honest man. Rossi left the ranch with a sense of deep frustration. Finch was a fortress, his story a seemingly impenetrable wall of deceit. He had had 3 decades to perfect his narrative, and he was not going to be broken by a single piece of old paper. Rossi called Leo with the discouraging news. The story Finch had spun was a perfect counter-move turning their own evidence against them. For a day, the hope that had surged through Leo curdled into despair. It felt like Finch was going to slip through their fingers, just as he had in 1992. That night, unable to sleep, Leo went back to the one place he felt close to his father, the maps. He unrolled the old, creased topographical map of the Shadow Creek area, the paper soft and fragile from years of handling. His eyes scanned the familiar contour lines, the shaded areas indicating dense forest, the blue line of the creek itself. And then he saw it. He had seen it 1,000 times before, but never with the new context in mind. Next to the name Shadow Creek, so small it was almost a freckle on the page, was a tiny hand-drawn X. It wasn't a mark for a meeting place. In the language he and his father shared, the language of maps, an X meant one thing, a destination, a point of significance, not a rendezvous, but a final stop. The next morning he was in Rossi's office. He laid the map on her desk and pointed to the mark. "This is where he was going," Leo said, his voice firm. "Finch's story is a lie. My father marked this spot for a reason. This is where we need to look." The X was more than a mark on a map. It was a testament from the grave. It was the crack in Finch's fortress. That small detail was all Rossi needed. She shifted her focus from Finch himself to the world around him. She started with the bear. The museum's records showed. It was donated from the estate of Alistair Finch, Marcus's older brother. Public records painted them as estranged, but a deep dive into old financial documents told a different story. Rossi unearthed the incorporation papers for a defunct business from the 1980s and 90s, Wyoming Frontier Trading. It was a fur trading company, with Alistair as the silent moneyed partner and Marcus as the man on the ground. Their estrangement was a convenient fiction to separate the clean money from the dirty work. This was the aha moment. The bear wasn't just a random trophy Alistair had acquired. It was a product of the very business he and Marcus ran. A business that, according to rumors in the old case file, dealt heavily in illegal pelts. Rossi now had a new line of inquiry, the employees of Wyoming Frontier Trading. The list was short. Most were deceased or had moved out of state, but one name stood out, Samuel Riggs. His employment had been terminated without cause in February of 1993, just 4 months after Danny Peterson disappeared. His last known address was in a small state-run retirement community in Casper. 2 days later, Rossi found Samuel Riggs sitting in a faded armchair in a communal sunroom. He was a thin, frail man, his hands trembling as he held a cup of tea. When Rossi introduced herself and mentioned the name Danny Peterson, the color drained from Samuel's face. The teacup rattled against its saucer. She didn't interrogate him. She simply sat down and spoke to him in a quiet voice, telling him about the wallet, about the note, about Leo's 32-year wait for answers. She spoke of secrets and how heavy they become over time. Samuel Riggs stared out the window, his eyes unfocused, looking at a past only he could see. The narrator could almost hear the war inside him, the terrified loyalty to a man like Finch, the fear of retribution, warring with a lifetime of guilt that had hollowed him out from the inside. He was silent for a long, agonizing minute. Rossi waited, letting the silence do the work. Finally, he turned his gaze from the window and looked directly at Detective Rossi. His eyes were cloudy with tears. The wall of silence he had maintained for over 30 years crumbled. "He made me help," Samuel whispered, his voice a dry, cracking rustle. "I didn't want to. I swear I didn't. But I was there." He took a ragged breath, a lifetime of secrets preparing to spill out. I'll tell you everything that happened that day." Samuel Riggs's confession was a torrent, the bursting of a dam that had held back a river of guilt for 32 years. As he spoke, the ghost of Daniel Peterson finally began to take shape, his final hours pulled from the darkness of speculation into the harsh light of truth. The story he told was one of greed, arrogance, and a single fatal moment of rage. On that clear, cold day in October of 1992, Marcus Finch and his reluctant assistant, Samuel Riggs, were not hunting. They were committing a crime. Deep in the remote clearing known as Shadow Creek, they were processing their latest illegal haul, the pelts of 2 bighorn sheep and a Canada lynx, all protected species. It was a lucrative, high-risk operation they had perfected over years, conducted far from the eyes of the law. They believed they were untouchable. They were wrong. Daniel Peterson, a man who read the forest like a book, had been noticing signs for weeks, unusual tracks, suspicious clearings. He wasn't lost on the day he disappeared. He was hunting, but not for animals. He was hunting for the truth. He walked into that clearing not by accident, but with the quiet determination of a man who had solved a puzzle. According to Riggs, the confrontation was tense and immediate. Danny saw the illegal pelts and his face hardened with a quiet, steely resolve. He knew Finch, and he knew his reputation. He told Finch he was going to report him. Finch, ever the charmer, tried to laugh it off at first, offering to cut Danny in on the profits. When Danny refused, Finch's demeanor shifted. The charm vanished, replaced by a cold, menacing threat. But Danny Peterson did not back down. He was a man of unshakable principle, and he would not be intimidated. It was that refusal, that quiet defiance, that pushed Marcus Finch over the edge. In his world, he was the apex predator, the one who made the rules. To be challenged so directly by a man like Danny, a man he viewed as a self-righteous rival, was an intolerable narcissistic injury. The rage was sudden and explosive. In a single violent motion, he struck Danny down. Riggs was paralyzed by fear, a horrified spectator to a murder that unfolded in a matter of seconds. As quickly as his rage had erupted, it was replaced by a cold, pragmatic calm. Finch was no longer a hot-headed killer. He was a meticulous predator covering his tracks. He was the one who devised the entire plan. They would bury Danny's body and his gear right there, in the soft earth near the creek at the very spot they knew Danny had marked on his map. Finch, in a moment of brilliant, cynical insight, reasoned that no one would search for a body at a man's intended destination. Then they drove Danny's truck back to the main trailhead to create the illusion of the hunter who simply walked into the woods and vanished. Finch had taken Danny's primary pack to sell the story, but he wasn't a detail man like Danny. He never noticed the small emergency kit Danny always kept under the driver's seat. It was a careless oversight, reinforcing the arrogance of a man who believed he'd thought of everything. The final twisted act of depravity was Finch's own idea. He took Danny's wallet as a trophy. Weeks later, he met with a private black-market taxidermist he used to preserve his most valuable illegal trophies. He gave the man the grizzly bear he had shot that season and a strange, specific instruction. The taxidermist, paid well for his discretion, followed the order without question, sewing the plastic-wrapped wallet deep inside the creature's flank. To Marcus Finch, it was the ultimate act of dominance. He had not only killed his rival, but he had hidden the proof of his crime inside the very symbol of his fabricated alibi. For 32 years, that bear stood as a monument to his impunity, a secret joke that fed his colossal ego. Armed with a sworn videotaped confession and a precise location, the case was no longer a cold one. It was a homicide, active and urgent. While a forensics team was dispatched to Shadow Creek, Detective Rossi, along with a convoy of state police vehicles, made the final drive to Marcus Finch's ranch. There would be no more coffee, no more polite conversation. Finch saw the vehicles coming up his long driveway and met them on the porch, his face a mask of confusion and indignation. But when he saw Samuel Riggs, frail and defeated, sitting in the back of one of the police cars, the mask began to slip. "Marcus Finch?" Rossi's voice was cold and official, cutting through the Wyoming air. "I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Daniel Peterson." Finch attempted one last bluff, a blustering denial. "This is insane. On the word of that old fool?" "We have more than his word," Rossi countered, her voice like ice. "We have the wallet, we have the note, and as we speak, a team is recovering Daniel's remains from a shallow grave in Shadow Creek, right where you left him, at the Mention of the body, Marcus Finch finally broke. The arrogance that had sustained him for over 3 decades collapsed, leaving behind a pathetic, frightened old man. The fortress had crumbled. Leo Peterson watched it all from an unmarked car parked at the end of the long driveway. He saw the moment of Finch's surrender, the way his shoulders slumped in defeat. He saw the officers move in, their movements swift and professional. He saw the glint of steel as the handcuffs were snapped onto Finch's wrists. He felt no triumph, no joy. He felt only the profound, heavy, and quiet release of a weight he had carried since he was 14 years old. The ghost that had haunted every day of his life was finally being exorcised, dragged into the sunlight not as a monster of legend, but as a frail and mortal man. The click of the handcuffs was a small sound, but for Leo, it was the sound that ended 32 years of silence. The arrest of Marcus Finch sent a shockwave through the town of Cody. The man they had known for decades as a rugged pillar of the community, a charming old-timer with a wealth of wilderness knowledge, was unmasked as a cold-blooded killer. The story of Danny Peterson's disappearance, once a sad local legend, was now a national news story, a grim testament to a secret kept for more than 3 decades. At Shadow Creek, forensic teams worked for days, carefully excavating the site Samuel Riggs had identified. They found what was left of Daniel Peterson, buried with the tools of the life that had been stolen from him. Every item was a confirmation of the story, another voice added to the chorus of truth. Marcus Finch, defiant to the end, never faced a jury. His body, weakened by age, could not withstand the stress of his unmasking. 3 months after his arrest, while awaiting trial, he died of a massive heart attack in his jail cell. He escaped a life sentence, but he did not escape justice. His legacy was forever rewritten, his name now synonymous not with frontier wisdom, but with deceit and murder. A week after his remains were returned to his son, a funeral was finally held for Daniel Peterson. It was a small, quiet service on a crisp autumn day, much like the one on which he had disappeared. Leo stood before the small gathering of friends and distant relatives, a man in his late 40s, with his father's steady eyes. He didn't speak of the murder, of the lost years, or of the man who had stolen his life. He spoke of a father who taught him how to read a compass, a man who loved the smell of sawdust, a husband who left a thermos of coffee on the counter for his wife every morning. He reclaimed his father's story, taking it back from the monster who had tried to erase it. After 32 years, Danny Peterson was finally home. In the weeks that followed, Leo began the slow, deliberate process of dismantling the museum of his grief. He took down the maps from his walls, the red strings and faded pins that had traced the paths of his obsession. He carefully boxed up the case files, the newspaper clippings, the endless pages of his own notes. He was not erasing the memory of his father. He was finally freeing himself from the hunt. The peace he found was not simple or clean. It was a scarred and complicated thing, a quiet landscape where relief and sorrow coexisted. The truth had not erased the pain of the past, but it had finally allowed for the possibility of a future. The impact of the case rippled far beyond one man's life. In the state capitol, inspired by the bizarre discovery that broke the case, a new protocol was enacted. Dubbed Peterson's Law by the media, it mandated a systematic review of assets and known associates for all high-profile cold cases, ensuring that the clues hidden in plain sight would not be so easily missed again. Leo, using the inheritance from the father he had only just recovered, found his own way to build a legacy. He established the Danny Peterson Grant for Outdoor Ethics, a fund dedicated to teaching young people the principles of conservation and respect for the wilderness that his father had held so dear. It was a way to ensure that his father's true spirit, that of a teacher and a guardian, not a victim, would be the story that endured. The story of Danny Peterson teaches us that no voice should be silenced forever, and that the truth, no matter how deep it is buried, can one day find its way to the light. Your subscription isn't just a click, It's an echo that amplifies these stories and strengthens our community. Please help this community get louder and stronger. Subscribe and let us know in the comments from which city you watch this incredible conclusion.